Last year alone, the billionaire class in the world increased their wealth by $2.3 trillion. That was just last year alone. The bottom 50% lost about that much.
Today, I am in UTS Podcast Studio in Sydney, Australia. So I'm here for a holiday, but I thought I would take that opportunity to speak to two of my good friends, Martin Tomitsch and Steve Baty, who are also co-authors of this book, Designing Tomorrow.
We're also still designing things in a way that begins with raw materials and ends with a finished product, rather than ends with raw materials.
And I had the honor of reading a preview of this book and provide my testimonial. And I thought this was such a much needed voice in the design industry, not just the design industry, but the world in general, in terms of what we should be doing, thinking and feeling about designing a better tomorrow for ourselves and for our children.
Yes, it's important that we are responsible and what products we buy and how we use them and how we dispose of them. But the bigger change we can achieve, the bigger impact we can achieve is through changing the organizations.
This conversation is going to be about what are some of the mindsets, the tools, the techniques that we can use in our practices as designers, change makers, entrepreneurs, teachers, whoever you might be, to bring more life-centered techniques, to bring more systems thinking, and how might we also collaborate better with business leaders, executives, and decision makers to align on producing products and services that are actually not just good for humans, not just good for the business, but also good for planet and all its life forms.
Designing tomorrow is an evolution rather than a revolution.
Welcome to Design Feeling, Martin and Steve.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be chatting to you today.
Yeah, we've been planning this conversation for quite a long time. I know when I was in London, we were trying to kind of do this virtually, but I'm glad we didn't do it because there's nothing better than being here in the flesh, in 3D, and talking about this. So, Designing Tomorrow. Well, this book is not out in its country of origin yet, in Australia yet, right? When is it coming out again?
So late April, early May, it's going to become available in Australia and the rest of the world. It's out in Europe already, so in the UK and other parts of Europe. You can already get it online and in your local bookstores.
Nice.
Since last year.
I did buy a copy of this in the UK, and Martin and Steve kindly gave me another copy here, which is signed. Well, my first question to both of you is, where did the idea for this book, where did it kind of germinate for you guys?
I think both of us were coming at this problem of the role of design in contributing to the problems that we see in the environment and around the world. We were both sort of thinking about that and grappling with it from the perspective of what our practice was contributing to the problem, and thinking about how do we actually start contributing to the solutions? How do we start contributing in positive ways and in ways that shift what we're putting out into the world and the way in which we're putting things out into the world into a more positive frame, and to be having a more positive impact. We spoke at UX Australia, I think that was 2021. Yeah. And afterwards, Martin sort of pulled me aside and said, I think we're coming at the same thing from different directions, but well-aligned perspectives. Should we turn this into something beyond just our talks?
I think it was kind of like we both had this idea in our head for a while and been thinking about these topics and what we could do about it. And then at the point of when we both spoke at UX Australia 2021, which was online because of COVID, that's sort of where those ways of thinking, our ways of thinking about it connected, and we started collaborating on the book and thinking about what this book could look like. So for me, so the way I'd been thinking about it before UX Australia It was kind of like an idea that was probably taking shape over some years for me, and in particular based on my research about life-centered design, and also, I guess, looking at Steve, what you were talking about was more from your practice experience. For me, it was more as an educator and researcher, academic at the university, teaching design students. I guess I was starting to think about how can we teach design students about this and educate them in different ways and give them the right tools and strategies to drive change in organizations as they leave universities and start working as designers and decision makers.
I can definitely see we have some heavy resumes in this room right now. So, Martin, you are the head of the Transdisciplinary School at UTS. You're also the founding member of the Media Architecture Institute and also the Life-Centered Design Collective. You've written, now 3 books. Besides Design Tomorrow, you've written Make Cities Smarter and Design, Think, Make, Break, Repeat. Is that the right order, right?
Yes,
cool.
You're right.
And Steve, you are the founder of Meld Studios, which is one of the premium boutique design studios in Australia and possibly the world. You are also one of the organizers of UX Australia, which is, I have to say, hands down, one of my most favorite conferences, UX conferences I've been to. It was definitely my first UX conference or UX event as a UX designer back in 2010, I think, in Melbourne. I remember, still remember the keynote speech by Jared Spool. And you have been past president at IXDA.
Yes,
that's correct. And you've been the judge at various Interaction Design Awards as well. So many years of experience that you bring together. But I wanted to kind of cast your mind back to some of your early days in design. Do you remember your first day when you thought, yeah, I'm a designer, or, I am a design educator?
It's probably a clearer one for you to answer than it is for me. I still wake up some mornings wondering whether that's true or not. So I'll let Martin go first.
So your question is like when I first...
Yeah, when did you start in your career, or what you call yourself, or call a career?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of... for me, it happened. It's not like I had this plan to one day be sitting in this podcasting studio and talking to you and with Steve about this book. It really, for me, I think it was quite opportunistic. I was always interested in both technology and creativity, and I guess I found my pathway through university, studying technology design and picking up other subjects from other areas. So in many ways, it's interesting for me now to find myself in the transdisciplinary school, because I guess I've always been interested in different disciplines and different ways of thinking. I mean, for me, maybe a pivotal moment for me was when I was a student doing exchange in Stockholm at the Technical University in Stockholm, the KTH, and learning about human-centered design there. That was... And sort of for me, it was really, I think, a pivotal moment to realize that, actually, these interests of mine can collide and connect through this idea of human-centered design, which is both about understanding technology, but also understanding people and using creative ways to make technology work better for people. And again, over the last few years, for me, that has changed to connect actually with another interest of mine. I've always been very interested in the environment and thinking about how we can have a more positive impact through the work we do, and also change organizations and how we live and work. And so hence the shift for me from human-centered to life-centered design, which for me is a framework that brings all of these things together. Yeah.
Steve?
As I say, like I still have days where I wake up and I'm not convinced that that's really what I should be calling myself or thinking of myself.
How did you mean?
Well, my intellectual background, my sort of academic background started in applied mathematics and applied statistics. Like I wasn't trained in design. I've read a lot of design. I've practiced design and design methods and design philosophies and ways of thinking. But on any given day, I might wake up and be thinking much more of myself in terms of systems and how systems work and how we think about the world and describe the world. And for me, that's always very much in sort of mathematical terms, almost in terms of models and the interactions between different sort of parts of systems. And that's really useful, as we sort of cover in the book and as we sort of use in our design work all the time. Understanding systems and system dynamics and the way in which different components interact and reinforce or not each other is a really, really critical skill. But for me, that skill comes from applied mathematics rather than from design. So depending on what I'm doing on any given day, I might wake up and think, wow, like I'm using my mathematics. Hey, told you it'd be good for something. Or I might be sitting there sort of going on that, like, really what I'm doing today is understanding people, understanding their place in the world, understanding their sense of meaning and significance and their needs, and working through a problem using the tools of design, like, and I feel much more like a genuine designer on those days than others.
Yeah. But I mean, in a way that that ability to think analytically and then using your mathematical skills, that's becoming even more important for designers now. And I guess that's also what we talk about in the book.
Absolutely.
But not to scare off designers. Like, it's not, we're not saying we need to, like, designers need to study mathematics, but the way, luckily, there are tools that I feel designers can connect quite well with, because as designers, we are used to using tools. That's what we do all the time. And so things like we use mapping tools. There are lots of mapping tools in design. And so one of the methods we talk about in the book, systems mapping, is actually a great way, I feel, for designers to start thinking about how, as you say, Steve, how the components fit together, how they influence each other, and the more analytical side of looking at the design problem, and also being a more holistic way of looking at the world and the context and the problems we're working on within that context. And that's something that, as an educator, I feel that's missing a little bit in design education at the moment, and that's definitely a shift that needs to happen.
So, from your point of view, what is a designer, and how does that definition need to change, do you think?
You can answer that.
Well, I was taught in different design programs and also different design subjects. I mean, in a way, now I maybe see myself a little bit as a transdisciplinary designer, because I'm in the transdisciplinary school. So it means I'm drawing on different disciplines in my work and through my work, and trying also to bring different approaches together. And again, that's what we're also doing in the book as well. So trying to, like, we draw a little bit on economics, for example. Again, the systems thinking movement that we also bring into the book, weave into the book. I should also say we've worked very closely with two editors on this book. So Jacqueline Hall and Verity Borthwick. And Jacqueline, by background, is a journalist and has also studied economics. And so she brought that experience and knowledge to the editing process. And Verity actually has a PhD in geosciences. So she's a scientist, a trained scientist, and then became an editor. So she also brought that knowledge to the editing process. So we for me, this the way, I guess, it's more and more difficult to box a designer into one particular area. But at the end of the day, a designer is someone that is able to understand different elements of a problem area, and then figure out how things connect. That's the creativity part. So connecting elements, and then also being able to imagine futures that don't exist yet. And then I guess the last part is to communicate that change in a way so that that they're able to bring others along on that journey, and then that's actually how we affect change.
Yeah.
The thing that idea of not boxing designers in, I think it's a critical one as we move into spaces where we're dealing in more complex, more interconnected, more non-linear type problems, where the boundaries are very, very blurry, and they necessarily require multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches. So there's a set of design capabilities, mindsets, sensibilities, philosophies that I think at the core of design practice, you can say, well, those are designly ways of thinking, being, and working, right? Like, and engaging with the world and making sense of the world and that kind of thing. And they're, like the ability to prototype, the ability to iterate, the ability to sort of hold multiple competing ideas at the same time while you test them, like that you test things in rough and ready ways and you invest more time as you build more confidence in an idea. So the idea of going from a sketch to a prototype to a pilot to like those sorts of sensibilities. The idea that thinking outside yourself, so externalizing your thinking through sketches, through the use of, like war rooms and design walls and these sorts of things, is an important part of shared sense making and shared exploration of the space. Like those are all things that you can sort of look at and go, well, those are designly things. If I walked into a room and I saw people working that way, I'd feel like there were designers in the room. But as you get into these areas where you're trying to tackle or impact poverty in a country like Australia, or the availability of healthcare in remote communities, or the prevalence of domestic violence or sexual assault sort of thing, which are areas that designers are absolutely working in today, they're working in those areas alongside a whole raft of people with different backgrounds. And I think that's where you sort of go, well, we want those people, social scientists, the economists, the policy people, whoever, to have the availability of those design tools, because there's power in them, especially when we're navigating these ambiguous spaces. But we're not trying to make them designers. We're trying to give them access to those designer-led tools. So the core might be well defined, but the edges are becoming increasingly blurry.
So what I took away from that was, although the title of the book is Designing Tomorrow, this is not just for people with the title designers.
That's right. Yeah, we specifically wanted to write it for not just designers but any decision makers.
Yes.
I think that's a good way to capture it. So anyone who is in a position, in a role where what they do involves making decisions, which is almost all of us, can benefit from the tools and use those tools. And as Steve says, we also try to describe those tools and the strategies in a way so that anyone, even without a design background, can apply those tools.
So what's wrong with how we are designing today, or how we've designed yesterday?
Where to start? So for me, again, bringing it back to this idea of life-centered design, one of the problematic ways of how we have designed in the past is that we center all the decisions around humans and their needs, their desires. And that was great for a little while, and it also helped in a way to cement the role of design and designers in business, because businesses loved it. Because if designers help them to better understand what the needs of the customers are, it means they can sell more stuff to more people. And so it was great for businesses, it was great for designers, great for the shareholders, but unfortunately not great for the planet, because and that's where we get into economic thinking and economic models. One of the problems is that organizations today still operate on outdated economic models that assume that there's an infinite amount of resources available to organizations, and also that there's an infinite capacity of the planet to regenerate itself and to produce new resources, and to deal with waste as well. And so it's what economist Herman Daly describes the empty full world problem. So we no longer live in an empty world. We live in a world where the use of our resources actually exceeds the regenerative capacity of the planet. And so hence why we need to add, so what we talk about in the book is that we need to add the responsibility perspective. So it's no longer just about viability. Can we actually make it affordable? The feasibility, is it possible to build it? And the desirability, like, do people want it? But we also need to think about the responsibility. So what are the ethical and environmental values? And we make the case that designers and decision makers are in the right place to be the custodians of that responsibility perspective.
Yeah. I think the piece that I would add to what Martin has just said is that we're also still designing things in a way that begins with raw materials and ends with a finished product rather than ends with raw materials. So ultimately, instead, what happens is we begin with raw materials, we make something which gets distributed, stored, sold, used, and then discarded. And because we've drawn our box around our responsibilities as ending with a finished product, the disposal of that product isn't really being designed as intentionally as the rest of it. So you might have a really well-designed, for a definition of well, and we tackle this sort of early in the book, but our notion of what that looks like ends with the finished product, not subsequently how it's disposed of. So you end up with a situation where the end product is full of toxic chemicals, materials that don't degrade or can't be recycled, can't be repurposed, is difficult to repair, all of which contributes to waste. And this is right across our economy. So whether we're talking about fashion or consumer electronics or white goods or the automotive industry, you name it, we've got this situation where increasingly over the last 7 decades, since 1950s, 1940s, we've increasingly been creating product, probably since the introduction of plastics mostly, but consumer electronics as well since the 80s have been contributing to this environment where our batteries, our transistors, our microchips, the casings of products, how we package things, how we ship things, are all contributing not just waste but pollution on a scale that we just can't sustain. So when we look at what was the problem with design that got us to this point, both our thinking around the impact that we might have and the resources that were available to us were infinite, even though we're in a closed system, and the way in which we were drawing our boundaries created these problems whereby we're not really thinking about, well, what happens afterwards. And we really need to start thinking differently. So somewhere in UTS is the Product Stewardship Centre of Excellence as an example of a group that's thinking about, well, how do you look right across the life cycle of a product and include its, how it's actually disposed of at end of life, and what does it mean to be end of life for a product? Where are the raw materials being sourced from, and are they reused materials or are they fresh extractions? How do you minimize all of that? And that's a real change in mindset over the last 2-3 decades where we're seeing it really emerge as a strong area of practice.
Yeah.
And it's really something that as designers we can think about those things at the product genesis stage, right?
That's right.
You can, but it currently ends with, as you say, we're thinking about the product and how it's used, but that's it.
Yes.
But we could also think about what happens after that, like how can it be repaired, how can it be reused, how can it be recycled.
We have to start thinking that way.
So obviously, design has evolved from being more kind of object-centered towards like human-centricity, and now we're having these conversations around life or planet centricity. But obviously, as humans, we first care about our needs, right? Like according to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we have all these like human needs and whatnot, and the whole notion of human-centricity came from like how do we meet those human or user needs first, and a lot of it came from like, okay, how do we make our lives easier and more convenient? Now, how might we convince humans to let go of some of that convenience for the sake of, I guess, things that we cannot really see or notice within our immediate environment? Like, a lot of the things that we talked about, the materials that get used, that gets dumped in landfills or in rivers and the ocean. We don't see that in our immediate environment. Like, it doesn't really impact us right in this moment. How do we care about this as designers?
I mean, for me, that's why it's so important that we change organizations, because a large part of our carbon footprint, our individual carbon footprint, is actually defined through the environment in which we live, through the society in which we live, and So we need to, it's not just about changing individual behavior. And we make that point also early on in the book. Yes, it's important that we are responsible and what products we buy and how we use them and how we dispose of them. But the bigger change we can achieve, and again, that's why designers and decision makers have actually such an important role to play. The bigger change we can achieve is through, the bigger impact we can achieve is through changing the organizations. And so if organizations change the way they produce products and using materials that are more environmental, that don't use plastics, or ensuring that products don't end up in landfill at the end of the life cycle, that they can be fed back into the lives into the product cycle, then actually consumers don't need to give up any of the things that they enjoy right now. And ideally, if you can...
So you're saying that there are no trade-offs at all?
Ideally, there shouldn't be any trade-offs. So ideally, we can design, we can change organizations and change the way we live and work so that we can continue enjoying all the benefits that technology has provided us with, but in a way that doesn't affect negatively the environment. But that's a big challenge. But also that's important because people are not, it's, as you say, it's very hard for people to change their behaviors and give up those luxuries, if you want to call them, or things that we are used to. And at the same time, organizations are not going to invest in things that are bad for the business. Like they're still operating on a neoliberal economic system, so they will always do things that are good for their business at the end of the day. So it's about, and that's what we also, the case we make in the book, is about how we bring all this together in a way so that everyone benefits essentially from the change.
I think although there are absolutely ways in which we can change organisations so that the things that they're producing have less impact, so that they are circular, so that they are, like better able to be repaired and that kind of thing. There are so many parts of the lifestyle in a country like Australia that just contribute enormously to the resource intensity of life in this country, right? So we waste something like 30% of the food that we produce, and a lot of it never even makes it off the farm. So recently, if you sort of were paying attention to the news, you would have seen reports of, farmers basically throwing away tons and tons and tons of fresh produce because the supermarket said, well, we don't want it. And there was a big thing as part of the Senate inquiry into competition in the supermarket and grocery industry or fresh food industry, that supermarkets are indicating to farmers that we'll buy X tons of your crop, and then at the time of harvest, turning around and saying, we'll take half of it. So it's a system, in part that's to generate buying power, purchasing power on their part. If I'm only going to give you buy half of it, then you're on the defensive. So from a negotiating point of view, you'll take whatever you can because you're not getting what you thought you were going to get. So it's a negotiating tactic. But the end result is that farmers have grown twice as much food as they thought they were going to be able to sell, and now it's sitting harvested, and they've got to do something with it.
But why have they grown so much surplus?
Because the supermarkets have promised that they'll buy it. So if I say to you, listen, this season I'll buy 10 tons of bananas from you, and then you grow 10 tons of bananas because you've got a promise from Coles or Woolworths or like a big supermarket. And then when the time comes, I say, hey, you know what? Like I only want 5. Well, I'll take what price I can get for that 5 because I need to do something with it. But I now have 5 extra tons of food. So the fertilizer that went into it, the manpower and the time and the energy that went into it, the water that I spent on it, like all of that kind of stuff. And now I've got food that the clock is ticking in terms of doing something with. So they feed it to the pigs or the cows and they literally just churn it back into the ground. It's wasted. So like we have a system in Australia where we waste something like $35 billion worth of food a year, and it's not waste after it hits the house. So it's not you and I in our cooking, although there's plenty that goes on within the household where we're wasting food. But a lot of it is in the way the system is structured and the way the economics of it are structured that generates this waste. So we can absolutely be doing things on an industrial scale, on the scale of the economy, to reduce our intensity and the impact that we're having on the environment in all sorts of ways. So that's one of the things that I would say. The other thing I would say is that humanity went on a bit of a sojourn, and depending on your philosophy, it either happened during the Renaissance or during the Enlightenment or during the Industrial Revolution onwards, where we developed this notion that we were separate from nature. And that's part of the problem. So we sit there and go, well, sort of nature's over there and we don't sit as part of it. And so we preserve parts of nature, and otherwise we make use of resources in ways that suit us. You asked the question before, how do we get people to realise that there's a problem and change their behaviour? One of the things we have to do is remind people that we are part of the environment. We're not separate from it. And so if we ruin the environment, well, we're ruining ourselves at the same time. So we can't live on a burning planet. We can't live on a choking planet. And we can't live on a planet where the oceans and the waterways are clogged with plastics and fish can't eat. And like all of those sorts of things, sooner or later, whether we want to or not, we're going to have to face the fact that we can't continue to operate in that kind of way, because we are part of that system. If we ruin it.
And that's where we have a lot to learn from indigenous cultures and ways of thinking. And
never had that split, right?
They don't look at it in a separate way. It's a very Western notion to look at humans being separated from nature. And as we acknowledge in the book, in a way, the things we talk about in the book, we only have to talk about those because of colonization and because of the way how Western cultures view the world and have, I guess, appropriated nature for their own benefits.
I think one of my favorite pages in the book is your principles of cultivating life-centered mindset. And you've got number one, which is purpose over profit. And the second one is what you mentioned, inspired by nature. Also, this third one is, interconnectedness, applying systems thinking, and so on. So one thing that you mentioned, Martin, earlier was around the need to change organizations. And Steve, you've been working with loads of organizations, throughout your career. Have you seen any examples of actually this happening, like in terms of like organizational change taking place, maybe through your work or maybe through any other case studies that you've seen?
The short answer is yes. That change is happening. It's not happening on the scale that we need it to yet. But hopefully those early examples lead to more examples, and people learn. Some of those examples are organisations that are doing good things. So Who Gives a Crap is a company based in Victoria, in Melbourne. They do toilet paper and paper towels and tissues and this kind of stuff. They're a for-purpose organisation. So they're definitely not a for-profit organisation. So that purpose over profit principle is absolutely there. They give money to causes rather than generating profit. They're generating contributions. But their entire mindset is around how can we take an everyday activity or an everyday item and do something with it in a way that's more regenerative and contributive rather than extractive. They're a great example. They've got a really good culture, great team of people. They're growing and they're trying to grow in a way that is still sensitive to those ideals. But they're a great example, right? So the materials that go into their products are recycled. The way in which they distribute it is thoughtful. But that whole notion of how do we set ourselves up to be more purposeful rather than dollar focused, they're a great example for me.
And I think there's also data, and the case we make in the book is that the argument we make is that organizations that are embracing this way of thinking and putting purpose over profit, that they will actually be the leaders in tomorrow's markets, and that the other organizations will be falling behind. And I mean, there's the reasons why companies like Apple are investing in this, because they know that that's what customers are going to be increasingly looking out for, and so it's a bit like what happened with UX design in a way, with user experience design, in that there was a certain expectation once companies started creating really well-designed products, and then other companies had to sort of follow suit and also invest in the design of the products and services that they offered. Otherwise, consumers would have gone to their competitors. And so that shift is going to happen again, and that's going to create also a lot of opportunities for designers to contribute to that shift.
Yeah. I'd say also that you've got a cohort of students and graduates. So kids who are 12, 13, 14, right through to their early 20s, who are looking at the world and feeling frustrated at the lack of action on some of these issues that are going to impact them. So they're really looking for examples of organisations that they can support, of politicians that they can support, of parties that they can support, where that person or that group or that organisation clearly seems to be fighting hard for them. So you'll talk to university students, Martin, you do this all the time. I talk to my kids about this kind of stuff, and they really do voice this frustration in organisations that just don't seem to get it, politicians who just don't seem to get it, who are actively helping make the problem worse rather than really seeing people fight hard to make things better. They're coming through. There's more of them than there are baby boomers. As the boomers die, and they're at an age when they are dying. And
well, just retire.
They're past retirement in a lot of cases, right? But their numbers are declining to the point where millennials and Gen Y, Gen Z, make up a much greater proportion of the adult population, let alone the population as a whole. But the adult population is now outsized the baby boomers. We're going to see a transition of wealth into younger generations over the next 10 years. I think I was reading yesterday, something like $3.2 trillion worth of wealth will be handed over, will change hands in the next decade to women.
Oh, wow.
Now that's huge. That is huge, because that's a fundamental shift in where wealth and influence lies, and the attitude that then leads to into a group of people who have otherwise had to just toe the line that somebody else is setting for them. So we are seeing these sort of fundamental demographic shifts, both in terms of where the voting power sits and where the wealth and influence sits, that will absolutely change these things. And organisations that are on the forefront of that and are demonstrating a willingness, when it's not easy, to do the work and find the ways and put in place the innovative business models and put in place the technology that actually, reuses materials or makes it easier to repair things, whatever it might be, they're the ones who are going to succeed.
Yeah.
And that's actually also a really good point, in that it's not just that organizations will lose consumers and customers and users, but also the top talent will go to those organizations that are embracing those values. Yeah. So they'll lose staff. Yeah, exactly. They won't be able to attract staff that they need, the talent they need, and they will lose staff.
So the risks are becoming clearer and clearer. So let's now, zoom into more of a micro level at that individual level. So let's imagine that whoever's listening right now, they work for an organization that they feel like does not really care about a lot of messages they're trying to give in this book around shifting to a more holistic way of solving problems. And let's say their values align more with caring more about beyond just human needs. What advice would you give them? It could be a designer, tech person, developer, manager. It could be anyone, right? But they're frustrated with that system.
maybe I can start with the more academic answer, and then you can give the more practice-based answer based on your experience, Steve.
We need both.
Yeah.
I mean, what we say in the book is that if you're frustrated with the organization and the practices they employ, that it's actually better not in the first instance to leave the organization, but to use the tactics we describe in the book to try to change the organization from within. Of course, that might not be possible, and there might come a point where you have to decide to if the organization doesn't address your values, doesn't meet your values, to actually leave the organization and look for another work place. But the way we sort of present this in the book, or we try to support this through the book, is by talking through this idea of a 1% change, and each of the 9 tactics that we describe in the book end on a 1% section. So at the end of each tactic section, we talk about how readers can start using some of the tools and strategies we described to start implementing that 1% change in organizations. And there's also a level up and level down pathway as well. So we're really trying to make it very accessible and very applicable that way. Steve, what do you think?
I have 2 threads to answer that question. So one thread is at an economic level, or at the level of the economy, the job market is quite tight at the moment, and competition for that top talent that you mentioned, Martin, is still quite strong. So if you're in an organisation whose values don't match yours, you could stay and use that as a point of leverage to try and get them to think differently about things. The simple threat that you might go might be enough for them to say, well, tell me more, right? So use that as an entree into having that broader discussion. The second thread is, well, what does that broader discussion look like? And one of the first things that I think you can do is sit down and look at your organization's product development, service development life cycle, and understand what that looks like from the point of view of expanding that system beyond the inputs that you purchase and the product that you produce or the service that you put out into the world, and start thinking more holistically around, well, where did those materials come from and how were they sourced, and what happens to the product when it's disposed of and end of life? And could we start thinking about little things like our choice of materials, our choice of packaging, our choice of storage, our choice of distribution, our choice of transport, the design of things such that they can become more repairable more easily, so standardization of parts and components to reduce weight. Like, those sorts of things are actually quite useful for an organization because they increase efficiency and they reduce cost. So a lot of organizations would see that and say, that's brilliant. That's actually a really useful thing for us to start thinking about. And if they've got a smart board, if they've got a set of executives who are thinking longer term about the health and well-being of that company, then the board will already be asking questions around these sorts of things. What are we doing to get ourselves ready, for example, for a set of circular economy policies and regulations that the federal government is set to introduce for 2030? That the states have agreed that they'll align with by 2030. What's your organisation that's putting products out into the world doing so that it can export into Europe, who now is putting in place regulations around the raw material inputs and the degree of recycled materials and the emissions intensity of those things? So you can ask those questions and frame it in terms of some really, really concrete economic and business drivers, that if you're in an organisation that's in any way forward-thinking and any way self-serving even, rather than really sort of short-term, return-driven, you probably are in a position right now where you can start having those sorts of conversations.
Mm. That extends also to, if any listeners here are UX designers working on websites, yep. It extends to that as well. And in our previous conversation, talked a little bit about that. The digital interactions globally contribute about around 5% of global carbon emissions, which is more than the combined aviation industry. And it's just getting worse because of the use of generative AI and increasing video content. And so, in particular in Europe, organizations are starting to pay attention to that and now starting to also pay UX designers to help them redesign their websites so they're using less carbon. And the little tools that anyone can just start using, like there's a free carbon emissions calculator for websites that you can just embed as like a little badge on your website. And so these are, again, the 1% changes you can start making. And importantly, and again, that's one of the tactics in the book, to hold organizations accountable by visualizing that impact. I think the problem at the moment, a lot of problems at the moment, come from the fact that these impacts are very invisible. It's kind of like out of sight, out of mind, and it's organizations can easily ignore it because it's like, no one can see it. But if you start visualizing it, then it becomes something that is more important, more urgent to be addressed.
Yeah. What's your, if you had to pick one tool or technique from the book, which one would be your favorite or one you use regularly?
For me, I'm one of the favorites and one of the ones I also use regularly now, both in teaching and running workshops, but also actually in my work, in my day-to-day work at the university, is backcasting. So it's a futuring tool, and essentially it starts in the future. So you think about an ideal future scenario or a future that you want to create, and then you work backwards from that imagined future. And it's kind of like, it's a mapping exercise. So it takes you through this process of understanding and mapping out the future and then comparing it to the now. And then you start looking at the transition steps that are needed in order for us to reach that future. And you can really apply that to any kind of situation.
For me, it's system mapping. So the idea of identifying the components of the system, the boundaries of that system, which then becomes a conscious choice rather than a default choice. The relationships between those things, whether they are positively or negatively reinforcing relationships between them, and whether they're linear or exponential relationships between things. It forces you to decide explicitly what you care about. And the minute you say, well, we care about this thing and not those others, you're creating the conditions where you have to make a choice that says, well, that is somebody else's problem. And it becomes then an ethical choice around, well, should it be? If we're putting this thing out into the world and we're creating this set of issues, maybe we should start taking some responsibility for those things instead. So it creates the conditions, in my mind, for a much better understanding of how a thing fits into the world, but also the responsibility for some of those impacts coming back within the organisation much more regularly.
Yeah, and that's what I really love about how you've laid out the book in terms of starting with understanding the systems first, the networks, and then intervening into it through envisioning the future, and also bringing people into that process, the whole kind of collaborative aspect of this. Because a lot of times we can feel alone in this mission. It's like, does anyone else care about the same things that I care about? And I love how some of your chapters around getting that buy-in, the shared buy-in with people. What would be your top advice in terms of what people can use to get that initial early buy-in from people?
I might actually answer the other part of that question first, and then pass to Steve, because he definitely also contributed more to the buy-in chapter of the book because of his background and experience in industry. But the part you said about collaboration, because they're actually two separate things. It's kind of like we can't do it on our own. It needs to be a collaborative effort. We need to have strong collaborators, and then the buy-in is a separate thing in a way. And so one of the things we talk about is this idea of collective impact, and how you can achieve collective impact through bringing together collaborators. But actually going through a systematic process of making sure you identify shared values, a shared mission. You have clear communication in place so that everyone works together towards the same goal. And you also, importantly, need what is called a backbone organization. So there can be a unit within an organization, it can be a network, it can be a group, it can be an actual organization in some cases, but it's some kind of entity that is responsible for driving that movement, because otherwise it doesn't happen.
that idea of getting buy-in is obviously important, especially when you sit within an organisational structure which has a mandate to do something. If it's a purpose-driven organisation, it still has a mandate to do something. And obviously, if it's a for-profit business, then the profit motive and delivering value back to shareholders in one form or another is clearly a really strong driver. So in either of those scenarios, it's really, really important to tie what it is you're trying to do and the change that you're trying to shift the organisation towards into terms that are important to them. It's very, very difficult to get an organisation to care about the things that you care about. You need to demonstrate that it's important for the things that it cares about, that it already cares about. So that typically comes down to being able to do more with less, reducing costs, increasing your number of customers or the revenue that you get from them, and generating profit. And even in a for-purpose organisation, generating that gap between what it costs to produce something and what people are willing to pay for it is important, because it means they can do more for more people. So even there, it's important. We really need to have to translate what we're doing back into terms that the people responsible for running that organisation will pay attention to. And it really does come down to those business fundamentals. Fine. Second thing to think about, though, is being able to very, very clearly talk about the direct impact what you want to change and what you want to do will have on those things, rather than indirect impacts. So talking about, if we do this, then it'll generate goodwill, and that goodwill will translate into good media, and that media will translate into good, like that's a really circuitous route, versus if we change our packaging, we can reduce our transport costs by X%. Okay, I'm all ears for that type of conversation, right? And that's pretty straightforward. That gets the conversation started, and then you can start to demonstrate additional value and get the ball rolling and rolling. And we talk a lot about these sort of reinforcing cycles and compounding change, where you're doing a little bit continuously that builds on itself, rather than trying to go all out on a big thing. I think it was Joss from the System Innovation Network yesterday who was talking about this difference between impact and emergent change. And I think that's really sort of key part of the message of Designing Tomorrow, is that rather than trying to have an impact which is fixed and static, we want people to put in place these emergent changes that are compounding and building over time, these positively reinforcing cycles that build over time. They're much harder to stop. It's how most of the problems occurred, is bit by bit compounding over time. And I think that's where our strongest solutions come from as well. So, yeah.
And so we say actually in the book that we see that Designing Tomorrow as an evolution rather than a revolution.
Love that. I think one of the key target audience that we need to address in our listening audience here is a lot of people who are currently, who've been laid off. A lot of my friends, former colleagues, have been in that situation or are currently in that situation. A lot of them are kind of, I guess, in a panic mode, trying to kind of look for the next role. I know in London, you get thousands of applicants per role that's posted on LinkedIn and so on. So how can people in that kind of, scenario think about, these things that probably are important to them personally, but doesn't really help them kind of find their next role?
Maybe I'll start again from the academic perspective, and what I usually say to students as an educator, because it's always been competitive. So I always encourage students, I guess, two things. One is to go out and connect with people and go to things like meetups, and so that they make connections and build a network will help them hopefully eventually to get the right job, the right role. But I also feel they can have an impact and working for an organization that meets their values. And the second part is to make sure that the application stands out, so that when they apply for an organization, for a role, that they're a bit different to all of the other candidates applying. And so one of the ways of doing that could be, of course, but that's another possibly not a financial question. One of the ways could be to just to go back to university and do a degree that helps them stand out, because they sort of like have a different qualification, a different resume, a different CV, different portfolio. Another way would be, I would like to think, reading our book and maybe taking some of those principles into your application and the way you apply and present yourself.
I think being employed, having a secure job, it feels a little trite for me to give advice around seeking a job in a tough market. So please take this in the spirit it's intended. And I know it's hard to be out of work and to be looking, especially in some of these markets and in some of these industries. So it's very difficult in tech-related industries at the moment. It particularly hard hit the design research community and the sort of UX and service design practitioner communities. It's really, really tough. The thing that I would highlight is that skill set has value and has relevance beyond tech. There is a path that helps you to take those skills, take that perspective, that philosophy, those ways of working, and apply them to other areas. So look for some of those emergent industries, perhaps. There are all sorts of opportunities in renewable tech, in renewable energy more broadly, in climate-related industries. Most developed economies, and Australia and the UK in particular, are heading down this path, the US as well, have this pipeline of innovation which is sorely lacking in design talent. There was a report released here in Australia in November last year out of the Department of Industry, Science and Agriculture, which highlighted the dearth of design capability in medium-sized enterprises in Australia, and that these small innovative companies are hitting this wall as they try and grow, where one of the key capabilities they're missing is design. Now that's a huge opportunity for design talent to look away from their traditional areas of expertise and look at industries where their past experience on paper doesn't look relevant, but those skill sets are absolutely applicable, and there will be ways of transitioning that. So I'd say go and look at those sorts of things and speak to those sorts of companies and think about the skills that you possess rather than the way in which you use them in the past as a path forward.
I love that.
And I've actually met recently a few designers who transitioned into that sort of space and who transitioned into sustainability roles or working for energy companies, where, as Steve says, you bring your amazing design skills and the way you think as a designer to the role, and you can contribute to the mission of the organization.
I love all that advice, and I think kind of it ties in with your message in the book, which is taking that time and space to zoom out and shift your perspective. Because a lot of times we have this like really tightly held beliefs and conditioning around what is possible and what is not, and we take that as facts, as reality. But we can shift that reality by just maybe like taking off those blinders and looking around a bit.
And I don't want to seem to be underestimating the stress involved in being out of work. Like the financial, mental, emotional stress of being out of work is huge. And I don't want to diminish that at all. But if you can find the space to rethink where your attention and time and energy is spent, I think there are opportunities in some emergent fields outside of the tech space. I also think they'll treat you better than some of those larger tech companies may have done in the past.
So throughout this collaboration between the two of you in writing a book, what's the one thing that you learned about each other that you didn't know?
I didn't know about Steve's mathematics background and that he studied at UTS some time ago.
I think for me, seeing Martin undertake a project and going about it in a really, really structured and methodical and disciplined way. I've known Martin for a long time, but not really seeing him in operation in that kind of way. It was really, really impressive to see.
Nice. And if you could design a solution to any problem, big or small, in the world, what problem would you solve and what would be the solution?
I have an answer for that one if you want to think about it.
Yeah, maybe you go first.
I'd tackle inequality first and foremost. So that would be the thing that I would try and tackle. And I think in tackling that, some of the shift in mindset would also then flow through into the way in which we handle the climate crisis and a range of other things. But if you can address, in particular, wealth inequality and income inequality, but it's probably a mixture of both, and do it on a global scale, the solution comes in the form of taxation. It comes in the form of the incentives for profit that exist in the developed world. So we've gone through this process over the last sort of 40 odd years of gradually ratcheting down the tax rates that apply on wealth, the tax rates that apply on corporate taxes and corporate profits, and the taxes that are applied on the highest levels of income. And it's happened right across the developed world. In Australia, until the 1980s, we had a tax on wealth transfer, so inheritance. The Queensland government got rid of it in the 1980s as a way of trying to attract retirees to the state. So people would relocate to Queensland where they wouldn't be taxed when they passed away and their kids could inherit tax-free, right? Very, very quickly, the other states realised that they were losing out on, like people were selling up their property and taking all their money to Queensland. And within the space of sort of 2 or 3 years, it disappeared.
Wow.
But it used to be the case in a country like America where the top income tax rate, and the same in Australia, the top income tax rates were like over 70%. The corporate tax rate was over 75% sort of thing. You got to keep a little bit of the profits and the rest of it went to the government so that they could build infrastructure and schools and hospitals and roads and irrigation and, all the rest of it. And the time in our countries, in both America, the UK, Australia, as three key examples that people look back on as the golden age of development and prosperity in this nation, was when those tax rates on profit and wealth were at their highest. Well, let's start there. Let's just start there, because what we're seeing at the moment, I think last year alone, the billionaire class in the world increased their wealth by $2.3 trillion. That was just last year alone. The bottom 50% lost about that much.
Wow.
That's a huge issue. So that'd be the first thing for me, and it would be done through taxes. But that would be where I would start. And I think once you start to address some of that resource inequality and wealth and income inequality, it'll start to flow through into some of these other areas as well.
And why does it matter to you personally?
It's hugely distorting in terms of how resources are allocated and what they're used for. It has a really detrimental effect on our democratic institutions. It's really toxic in terms of the quality of our democracy. And you end up in situations where wealth absolutely buys power and influence, to the point where in a country like America, the bastion of democratic principles in the Western world, hasn't operated as a functional democracy for at least 40 years, according to Stanford University. And by that, they mean if you look at the laws that have been enacted by governments, so by the elected representatives, and you look at whose interests those align with, increasingly, it's been the top 10% and then top 5% and top 1% of wealth holders in the country rather than the actual bulk of Americans. So it might be a representative democracy functionally in terms of how elections are held, but in practical terms, it's not at all. It's a oligarchy. And that's not a good thing at all. It is absolutely sort of toxic and dysfunctional for societies.
And with that also comes access to education, which influences your quality of life. There's definitely an interesting systems map in
Absolutely.
all of that.
Yeah.
Martin, what about you?
It's a really good one, but maybe building on that one in some ways on some of the things that Steve mentioned, for me would be making the collaboration between universities, government, and industry more functional, more effective. There are lots of reports that point out issues, in particular here in Australia, in this regard, but I think it's also a problem globally. And it seems like there's a lot of fragmentation, so duplication of efforts, which leads to waste of resources and money, often taxpayers' money. It's coming back to the taxes and the role of government. And if those three sectors or groups, entities would collaborate better and more effectively, we could actually achieve a lot more. So obviously government plays an important role, not just in terms of setting taxes, but also in terms of setting regulations, which drives the behavior of organizations and their responsibilities, the risks that they have to manage in terms of reporting back to the government. And of course, that's a big task for government, and it's getting more and more complex. I think that's one of the challenges for government, is that the world is changing, and so making these decisions and setting regulations is much more difficult. Also connected to the increasing adoption and advancement of technology, like AI, autonomous vehicles, and government sort of struggling with understanding how they need to set regulations. And that's where universities can come in, because universities have all the knowledge, but often that knowledge ends with a paper that is published at a conference and cited maybe by some other academics, but doesn't actually make it out into the real world. And for me, that pathway, and also that's what we at the Transdisciplinary School here at UTS are working on, this is the impact, making sure that the research actually has an impact, so that research somehow connects to what government does, informs what the government does, which then can inform regulations, which changes what the industry does, which actually it's a circle, because it also changes university education and the pathway of our university graduates and how they can contribute to the work that organizations do.
Yeah.
Difficult one though.
Yeah.
Both complex ones. Will take us a few years.
I thought you were going to say something like,
it's easy. Mine's straightforward.
I thought you were going to say something like, make it easier to kind of squeeze the last bit of toothpaste out of the tube.
That would be good. And
because one of my first jobs that I got when I first moved from Nepal to Australia was that of a kitchen hand in a pub, and I used to do the dishes in the kitchen, prep stuff, and all the plates from the restaurant kind of come in like in massive trolleys. I used to be horrified at how much food people threw away here, because in Nepal, there's no concept of throwing a food, because we pretty much eat the whole thing. But I just wow, there was perfectly good food that people are throwing away.
Yeah,
and I was like, what if there was a way to kind of reuse all this food? Maybe have I was thinking back then, I was like, maybe have a restaurant or a side of a restaurant that only sells leftover food that people have thrown away. Then we can probably make it hygienically safe to eat again. Again, those crazy ideas I was having when I was working that job back then.
Yeah, but we talked earlier about food waste, and it's an interesting challenge that speaks to a cultural problem, which is that we have this idea that there's plenty, and so it's fine to throw away perfectly good food, right? It permeates the way in which we approach materials and the way in which we approach consumption. That there's this endless supply of good stuff just out of sight that we can just continue to draw upon.
But not only that there is plenty, but also that it needs to look perfect. So that's one of the other problems with food waste, that a lot of food is thrown out because it doesn't look pretty enough to go onto the supermarket shelf. And there's actually a Sydney-based startup called Good and Fugly, and they
use them at home.
Yeah, we got them as well. Yeah, they actually emerged during. It was an idea that emerged during the COVID pandemic. I think during lockdown. Yep. The founder was like, what can I do that is meaningful, has an impact, and they identified that issue. And it's a great example in many ways demonstrating what we talk about in the book, in how you can apply creativity to solve some of these problems and come up with a new business idea that is actually really successful. So what they do is they go directly to the farmers and buy the produce from farmers that is too ugly to go on supermarket shelves and sell it directly to the customer. So it's a genius way to get around that issue. But to your toothpaste problem, that's
very important.
That's a very much 20 years ago kind of definition of human-centered design, right? And I remember when I started maybe teaching, watching one of IDEO's videos, and they talked about this big case study they'd done about toothbrushes, not toothpaste, but toothbrushes. And they were, I think, asked to redesign toothbrushes for children. And so they did what designers at the time did, design researchers. They observed children brushing their teeth, and they figured, children held them with their fist. But the way the children toothbrushes at the time were designed, they were just a smaller version of the adult one. So actually it was the opposite, right? So they were like, we have to make them actually bigger with a bigger handle so that it supports how they hold it. So again, very much 20 years ago, kind of human-centered design, a human-centered problem. And these problems are still important, and we have to continue, someone has to continue solving those as well.
Sure, but now you've got a toothbrush handle with a lot more plastic being used.
That's true. So we got to think about where the material comes from. Is it bamboo, etc.? But they're sort of old problems that continue to be important, but they're kind of BAU now, I would say, business as usual, whereas we need to shift to addressing those big systemic problems.
Yeah. So now, coming towards the end of this chat, let's imagine that it is your last day on planet Earth. And it's a question that I ask all my guests. I did ask you this before as well, Martin. Imagine you're on your deathbed. You're about to kind of breathe your last few breaths. And someone comes up to you with a tiny Post-it and a Sharpie and asks you to write your last few words for humanity. What would you write on the tiny Post-it?
I don't even remember what I said last time, so I have to think about this again.
You said something very wise.
It's only one word, or it can be a sentence.
Whatever you can fit on that Post-it.
I think you even said it's then on a billboard or something, right? It's
well, we have the option to put it up on a massive billboard that everyone can see.
It,
I say this to my kids a lot already, which is first and foremost, be kind. That would be it. Whatever it is that you're trying to do, whatever it is, if you approach it from that point of view of kindness, and I think Buddhists would tell you to approach it with a sense of compassion, but that idea of I'm coming in with genuine good intent to whatever the situation might be, that would be my starting point. If I had a second Post-it note, or I wrote small enough to get a second sentence in there, it would be begin. Start small, but start. Just get going type of mentality. I think with those two things in mind, we can achieve an awful lot.
Love it.
Whatever I said last time. No. Maybe it's something that we often are consumed a lot by little things, little worries that seem very big to us. And they actually don't really matter, and they have a funny way to work themselves out usually. So maybe my message would be not to worry about those little things that may feel big to us individually, and to instead focus on the things that we can actually influence and change. And again, to Steve's point, start small, 1% change, and doing something that is meaningful.
Love it. Great. So, Steve and Martin, it's been such a wonderful chat talking about a lot of the things that we all collectively care about here around not just humans and the needs, not just business strategies and profits, but also the impact that we are having with all that work on the planet, non-human life forms and the environment. And to celebrate all those wonderful chats, you'll be giving away 2 copies of Designing Tomorrow. And so for people to win a copy, what do they need to do?
What we'd like people to do is send us examples of an organisation or a local community group or an individual who's having a positive impact in a small but growing way, that they can share with the rest of us, so that we can all see that there's good happening in the world, that there's positive change happening in the world, and take that as a bit of an incentive for us to do something as well.
Great. So if you're watching this on YouTube, or if you're listening to this on any podcast platforms, use whatever social platforms we're on. So if it's YouTube, you can drop a comment on YouTube. If you're listening to this on a podcast platform, you can drop a comment on one of our LinkedIn posts or maybe the Instagram post, and we will look for some of the best answers, and we'll get Martin to pick one and Steve to pick the other one, and we will send you a copy of this brilliant book, Designing Tomorrow.
Excellent.
So the battery of my camera has run out just then, so you won't be able to see my face right now, but I'm still in the room. But thank you so much, both Steve and Martin, for this wonderful conversation, for taking the time out of your busy days. And thank you, Martin, for booking this wonderful podcast studio for us at UTS. And I'm kind of hooked in this idea of doing in-person interviews now. So I'll probably have to sort something out, when I go back to London. And anything that you're currently excited about for the next few months that's happening in professional or personal lives?
So at UTS, we're actually looking at currently how we can connect transdisciplinary thinking and approaches with sustainability and sustainability issues in the world and in organizations. And so we'll try to push that agenda a little bit more over the next few months. Yeah, hopefully launch something in next year or so.
Great stuff.
For me, I've got on May the 9th, the Product Stewardship Conference hosted here at UTS, and I'm appearing on a panel to discuss the role of design in product stewardship. Could be kind of interesting for a day, but it'll be a good discussion, and it's a sort of a critical lens on some of the issues we've been talking about today.
Great stuff. Well, all the best for both of you, and let's keep in touch and see you again soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nirish.
So, what did you think of the conversation? What's the one thing that stood out to you? Drop it in the comments below, and please consider giving this video a like and a subscribe if you'd like to support this channel and get this video out to more people. And feel free to drop me a line if you'd like to share any thoughts or ideas or maybe suggestions for any topics or guests that you'd like to see. See you next time.